Did you know the classic Old West gunfight as we know it is a complete myth? The dramatic showdown between a lone righteous hero and a ruthless villain was a spectacular lie Hollywood sold us. It turns out that almost everything you thought you knew about these legendary duels is a fabrication, a fantasy created for the screen. The truth is, the real Old West was a far more brutal, chaotic, and messy place than any movie ever dared to show. The famous one-on-one duel was so rare it was almost unheard of, and the brave gunslingers of film were likely living with constant fear and psychological trauma. We're going to pull back the curtain on the brutal reality of frontier gunfights and reveal a history far more compelling than the Hollywood myth. The idea of the quick-draw duel, where two men face off in a dusty street, is a fantasy that comes from Hollywood, not history. In reality, one-on-one duels were almost non-existent in the Old West. The tradition of formal dueling, with seconds and physicians present, was a tradition that largely ended after the Civil War. On the chaotic frontier, you were much more likely to get shot in the back than to face an enemy head-on. The goal was simply to get the drop on your enemy, not to have a fair fight. Even the most famous quick-draw duel in history, the 1865 gunfight between Wild Bill Hickok and Davis Tutt, wasn't what you'd expect. It didn't start over a matter of honor or justice, but over a simple gambling debt. When Tutt publicly wore a pawned gold watch, it was seen as a provocation that justified violence. During the actual confrontation, the two men stood about 75 yards apart, a distance that required a careful aim, not a frantic quick draw. Hickok wasn't fanning his gun or shooting from the hip. He carefully steadied his aim across his forearm and fired, a testament to skill and marksmanship, not flashy gunplay. The event reveals that in a society with weak legal institutions, a personal insult could quickly turn into a deadly confrontation. The legendary gunfight at the OK Corral also proves that reality was far messier than the movies. It wasn't a sudden, climactic event. Instead, it was the culmination of a long, simmering feud between two rival groups with deep family and political ties. The 30-second shootout occurred in a narrow, vacant lot, and participants were as close as 6 feet apart. The fight was a chaotic, close-quarters melee, not an elegant standoff. It also wasn't a triumphant final act. It was the start of a cycle of revenge that resulted in the assassination of Morgan and the attempted assassination of Virgil Earp. These famous gunfights highlight a simple truth. Justice wasn't always dispensed by a lone, courageous figure in a clean one-on-one duel. The reality of frontier violence was brutal and unforgiving, driven by personal conflicts, not a clear struggle between good and evil. The guns themselves were far from the fast-firing, endlessly loaded weapons you see in the movies. The quintessential Old West pistol, the Colt single-action Army revolver, was a 6-shot firearm, but it was often carried with only 5 rounds for safety. Its biggest limitation, however, was reloading. Reloading was a slow and cumbersome process that could take up to a minute. First, you would have to open a loading gate, half-cock the hammer, and then use an ejector rod to push out each spent case one by one. Then you had to manually insert new rounds one at a time. A full reload was impossible to do in the middle of a gunfight. This single technological reality meant that gunfights were short, abrupt, and decisive, often over before a reload could even be considered. The flashy gun handling techniques from Hollywood were also pure fiction. The practice of fanning the hammer with the palm and firing from the hip was not a combat tactic, but a theatrical display used in Wild West show performances. Even Wyatt Earp had contempt for the gun fanner, stating that such a person stood small chance to live against a man who pulled the trigger once. Real gunfighters knew that accuracy, not flair, was what kept a man alive. It's also important to remember that the pistol was not the most common firearm in the Old West. The lever-action rifle or shotgun was far more practical for a cowboy's daily work, which included dealing with things like snakes and rustlers. The pistol was often considered a secondary tool and was frequently carried in a saddlebag because a heavy gun belt was considered a pain in the butt for long days on the trail. The real Old West cowboy saw a firearm as a utilitarian tool for a job, not a central part of their identity. We'll be diving deeper into the history of the American frontier in future videos, so if you're interested in more untold stories, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss out on what's to come. We enjoy reading your comments and hearing what folks have to say. Hollywood also completely misrepresented the physical and mental consequences of a gunshot wound in the 19th century. Bullets of the era were designed to deform on impact, causing massive damage to tissue and splintering of bone. The entrance wound was often smaller than the exit wound, which could be massive and lacerated. The mortality rates from these wounds were staggering. A single shot to the abdomen was fatal 87% of the time, and a chest wound had a mortality rate of 62%. A single hit to the torso was, in essence, a death sentence. The medical care available on the frontier was also primitive and often as dangerous as the wound itself. Surgeons lacked knowledge of germ theory and antibiotics. Infection was a leading cause of a person's demise. In cases of severe bone damage, the primary surgical response was amputation, a painful and life-altering procedure. For head wounds, the mortality rate was as high as 95% if the internal table of the skull was fractured. A gunshot wound was not a minor inconvenience. It was a potential life sentence to a slow end or a lifetime of painful, debilitating consequences. Beyond the physical scars, the psychological toll was an undeniable reality. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder was not yet understood, but the human brain's response to trauma has not changed. A person who had survived a gunfight would have likely suffered from chronic hypervigilance, a constant search for hidden dangers, as well as persistent fear and a sense of helplessness. The myth of the stoic, unbothered gunfighter is a complete fabrication. In reality, he was likely a person suffering from severe psychological trauma, a hidden cost of the frontier justice he was forced to mete out. And finally, the most enduring myth of all, that the Old West was a lawless, unregulated frontier where every man openly carried a gun. The historical record reveals a starkly different reality. Many famous Old West towns, including Dodge City, Abilene, and Tombstone, had strict gun control laws. In fact, the famous gunfight at the OK Corral was, in part, an attempt by Wyatt and Virgil Earp to enforce a local ordinance that prohibited the carrying of firearms within the town limits. These laws were not a political or philosophical statement. They were common-sense measures for public safety. Visitors were required to disarm, either at a hotel or a lawman's office, and residents were expected to keep their guns at home. The reason for these regulations was primarily economic and civic. Civic leaders wanted to attract families and businesses and realized that the chaos and violence associated with a lawless town were bad for business. The truth is, the Old West was a more brutal, yet more human place than we've been led to believe. The true story of the American West is one of pioneers who, in the face of brutal reality, actively sought to establish order and justice through civic regulation, understanding that a peaceful society required the hard work of building institutions. We enjoy hearing your thoughts and what you have to say in the comments. Let us know what's one of the biggest myths you've heard about the Old West that you'd like us to cover next. And if you haven't yet, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell.